getting ratings was important to John. He actually would say, well, I want shows that people like to watch. It's the public that matter to me.
We thought he was lovely.
One of our favourites.
One of our favourites. Anything he's in, I'll watch.
He was a good actor, he was all right.
He always just came across as being a very sort of casual bloke.
His manner, polite, or everything.
His versatility.
He was just totally believable in everything he was in, I think.
I think he could appeal to the working class as well as the middle class as well as the upper classes.
He makes mistakes, and I think that's quite sort of appealing.
Oozed humanity.
His vulnerability that went with the tough guy side of him.
He had deep goodness in him, and a tremendous sense of fun and responsibility, all hidden in this wonderful flower.
Integrity, strength, conviction, and truth.
An honesty which sort of cut through any board or any kind of fashion.
A nun wrote and said he was without side and without conceit.
The camera certainly loved him.
I mean, his eyes are fantastic.
I think as an audience, you were constantly drawn to the mystery of this man.
John was born in 1942 in Stowell Street, West Gorton, Manchester. It was a street that all the Thaws lived in fact. I lived there with John, my father and mother. Next door we had my gran and granddad. Further up the street was my Auntie Beat and Uncle Charlie.
And he was a lovely, happy little boy because his mum was there then. And he was in and out, and he never knew where he was, you know. He was always with me.
Mum and Dad decided they wanted something better, so we came here to Burnage, Manchester. It's a Manchester Corporation house. It's flat, there's an upstairs and a downstairs, and we had the downstairs. And it was a beautiful home, a happy home. But eventually, Mum decided she wanted to go.
I mean, I always had this theory that perhaps she had the same kind of starry talent that John had, and to be a woman with that kind of personality in that era was very difficult. You know, you were very frustrated, stuck in a council flat, looking after two kids. I mean, you know, I'm not excusing her, because I do think she did damage him.
Dad got me and John together, and he said, now, boys, Mum's gone. There's only the three of us. So we've got to make the most of it, and let's just all pull together, and that's going to be life from now on.
When John's mum left, he was only 7, and Raymond was 5. And his dad was on long-distance lorry driving at the time. So John sort of took over Raymond in a way, and my brother left it with the lady above to make sure that they were up and had a breakfast and everything before they went to school, and make sure they were in at night if my brother wasn't back.
John was left with all the cooking during the average day. The average day, I've got to admit, was a little bit rough, but we survived.
They came to us a couple of times a week, then all weekend. But I used to go up with, one day I'd take pea and ham soup up in a pan.
I mean, his childhood was spent, you know, among a group of, I mean, within a wide family network. But the core of that family was his father, whom he loved very, very deeply, and his younger brother Raymond, whom he felt he was responsible for and had to look after.
And he told me a story once about how he got Ray dressed up in his best clothes, and he himself, and I think they were about 7 and 5 or something like that, and they went round to where they knew their mum was and knocked on the door, and I don't know if he actually asked the mother to come back, but their mum gave them a 6pence and said, you know, no, I can't come. Now, I'm sure she had her reasons, but I cannot imagine a more painful scenario for 2 little boys than that.
I mean, that was a terrible story.
I think any man that is brought up by men, in a household of men, loses something. There's a softness about a woman bringing you up. There's the cuddles and the kisses and the and the telling you you're wonderful and all that I think women are more apt to do than men are a bit, come on then, get on with it, you know, come on, son.
This is Greenend School, the junior school that John and I came to, or the school that John used to drag me to. Out here in the front are the playing fields of the school, and this is where John got the bug for acting, I think, because at the fete of a weekend, they used to have a talent contest, and he would jump on stage, do a few gags, a few impersonations, and sometimes he would win the contest.
I used to go with Raymond and John to the Odeon. John actually was the entertainment during the children's Saturday morning cinema. One of the perks for Raymond and I, obviously, was that we got him free, because John was the star. At home, my dad acquired a really old-fashioned microphone.
But he connected it round the floor, a piece of wire, to an old wireless. And we used to sit on this settee, all in a row. But John used to be under the stairs and be singing Lovely Bunch of Coconuts and all things like that. And he was very good singing all the Al Jolson songs. And it used to come out on the radio and we used to clap as though we were at the theatre. It was really good.
For us young ones who were in the concert party, it was absolutely fantastic, and we did some superb shows. John came along with his brother Ray, who wasn't really old enough to join the youth club, but it was like, have me, have my brother. So we had his brother. And John, when he joined the concert party, liked to do mainly his own thing, in that he enjoyed doing an individual act, which was based very much on music hall. You know, roll out the barrel, I've got a barrel of coconuts, that kind of thing.
John found some Olivia records of Laurence Olivier coming out with these Shakespeare plays, and it was just Olivia speaking. And I remember John, for hours and hours, would listen to Olivia.
To be or not to be, that is the question. Whether it is nobler in the mind to suffer the slings and arrows of outrageous fortune, or to take arms against a sea of troubles, and by opposing, end them.
John went on to Ducey Avenue Technical College, and there at that school they were doing more Shakespeare-type plays and stuff like that, and John really got the bug for it.
He would sit on a bench when it was sunny, under a tree, and read a poetry book. But he was always taking one of the main parts, right from the first to the fifth year.
The school itself produced, a variety of people, in business world. You would either be a policeman, a salesman, or a burglar.
That was the most important experience for him, really. Feeling that your life was set out for you, was limited for you by the streets in which you grew up, and your horizons were not to be any wider.
The headmaster, Sam Hughes, I think he saw a talent that John had and said to John, why don't you try and become an actor? I mean, a professional actor. But John thought, well, you don't become a professional actor from where we come from.
But this, of course, meant training, it meant RADA, it meant getting grants, and here there were difficulties. John was 2 years too young, and about 4 or 5 subjects in GCE too light. But we rallied friends, packed the committee, and in the end, we got the grant. A bit of manipulation, but I think in the end, justified it.
And I shall always be very, very eternally grateful to you, Mr. Hughes.
Thank you, Sam Hughes and John Hughes.
But the one thing Dad always said to him, John, try it. If you fail, come back to Burnage. Ray and me are always here.
His dad one week said to me, if he's going to go to this place, he said, I can afford him a new suit now. He said, so will you take him for this suit? Because you always went with your children in those days for a suit. He said, but do let him have what he wants. So we go to this outfitter's. And we're looking round. I said, oh, John, this is nice. He said, not for me. So we have another wander around. I said, this is nice. Not for me. He said, and you did say my dad said I could have what I wanted. So he had a look and he said, oh, this is it. And I nearly died because it was this teddy boy suit. And he went and tried it, and it looked awful. So he got it, and we went home, and his dad was home, and he said, "Did you get him one then? Where is it?" And at the time, they used to give you them in a cardboard box with a bit of a handle on. And so John brought this cardboard box out. He'd folded it back up again and put it in there. And when he went to try it on, I said to his dad, "Don't let your jaw drop when you see it." He did say he could have what he wanted. And when he came out, his dad said, "That looks fine, son." And it looked awful. And Tom Courtney pulled him to bits when the first time he saw him in it. Never stopped ribbing him about it, but he thought he was the bee's knees.
I remember we all went in my Uncle Charlie's van, John, I, my dad and Sandra. We all went to London to his RADA audition. And he came out and my dad said, "How did you go, John?" He said, "I'm not sure, Dad, but I think I've done all right." He was very apprehensive, obviously coming from Burnage to the big smoke and RADA and fellow actors and middle-class people who sent their daughters and sons there. So John found it very scary in that environment. And he was kept to himself purely because he didn't felt he could mix with those sort of people. But he met people like Tom Courtney, which helped him to break that ice.
I can remember the first time I talked to him because nobody dared talk to him. He looked so... But you see, he was only 16. He was very shy. But he didn't look shy, he just looked frightening. But I don't know, there was something about him that I just liked. And I remember I said something and all he said was, I'm all right, I'm all right, I'm all right. But I persevered and shortly he began to sort of actually say words back at me and we became best friends.
And I remember him saying that after the first term at RADA in London, he went back home to Manchester and very nearly didn't come back. He just found the whole thing so alienating.
The top voice teacher at RADA was a man called Clifford Turner. And he had written books. He's dead now, bless him, but he was getting on there, and he was like one of the authorities in the theatre on voice. And one of the first things we as a class had to do was to get up and each read, and the boys and the girls, each read the prologue to Romeo and Juliet, which goes, if I remember, two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene, etc. And so he goes round all the different ones sitting in a circle, and he gets to me. He says, right, you. So I got up and I said, two households, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona, where we lay our scene. And he said, I'll never forget, he said, "Oh, sit down, you'll drive me mad."
After about a year at RADA, John wrote to Dad saying he was coming home for the weekend. And I'll always remember, it's Sunday, Dad said, John's coming home, ready to see us. So we waited, we cleaned the place up a little bit. There was a knock on the door, and Dad said, "That must be John, right?" So I opened the door, and there in front of me was John, but all his hair had changed, it was all brushed back. He had a little goatee beard, his accent had changed, the Manchester accent had gone, and there was a, let's say, a London southern accent. And I just couldn't believe it, and I said, "John, is that you? What have they done to you?" But it was him, but they had changed him.
And I think he found his first year pretty tough going, but obviously at the end of it he said, "I'm going to do this, I'm going to crack it," and indeed he did in a very big way, and won the major prize at the end of his third year.
All the young women in their first term or year were in love with either Tom or John, and I was in love with John. But I didn't know him then. I didn't meet him until 2 years later when I worked with him. I was already in love with Laurence Olivier, who wasn't of my generation. But John Thaw, I was absolutely knocked out. So when I walked in on the first day of rehearsals, I was, there was this leather-coated, jacketed, kind of, intense-looking, fascinated by theatre and by his craft. He knew much more about the theatre than anyone I'd ever met. He'd read Ibsen and Strindberg and Chekhov, and that was where I met John. and never look back, as they say.
While we were still at RADA, I went to live in a huge maisonette in Highbury Crescent, and John joined me there, and that's where he discovered this strange music that I used to listen to, which became so much a part of Morse.
Or Tom would bring in, you know, something and say, John, you've got to listen to this. You know, they'd all sit in the armchairs, complete silence. And then they'd start, you know, conducting to whatever it was they were playing.
Sort of lying on a sofa, transfixed by it. Are you all right, John? Just being moved by music. And he couldn't believe that all this stuff was there that he hadn't known about.
During the 60s, just before he married Sally Thaw, he was an incredibly hard-drinking, hard-wenching, almost bankrupt young actor looking to make his mark and being left behind by people like Nicol Williamson, Albert Finney, Tom Courtney.
He christened me Golden at the time, because so much was happening to me that wasn't happening to him, but resentful or jealous, not a sign of it. I was best man at John's first marriage to Sally.
I had Abigail, I don't know, 18 months after we were married. And that was an extraordinary time of happiness. And, I mean, he just adored his baby.
See me pushing a pram along? Oh, coochie, coochie.
Hey, if you don't stop that, I'll chuck this at you.
A proper comedian I'll be.
John was working. He was doing so many television plays and little bits of film and so on. I mean, he wasn't an actor who ever stopped working. I think we separated because I was a young woman who didn't know what I wanted, and I think it's very difficult to be with someone who you don't know what you want. I wasn't very confident, and I didn't know what I was doing. We were too young. We were children.
Although he was only 22 and very young when we made the series, in those days we took risks. We could take on somebody of that age and give them the leading role in a mid-evening drama series. And John was very effective.
I'm Sergeant Mann, SIB. I've come up from brigade.
And for me, John had an amazing stillness, an interior stillness, which gave him great authority somehow.
I think Red Cap established him as a star because in television, if you appear regularly on the screen in a series of, say, 13 episodes, people know who you are. And don't forget that we're talking, what, 30 years ago?
I was directing a stage play which was going to come into the West End, starring Sheila Hancock.
And then they came up with this name, John Thaw, and I have to confess I hadn't heard of him. I really hadn't. But anyway, they said, and they were really thrilled about it and said, well, meet him. So I swanned in, West End star as I was at that time, and there was this sort of thing cowering in the corner, looking kind of sultry and slightly sulky about the whole thing.
And I wasn't particularly looking forward to the rehearsal starting the next Monday after the weekend.
He hadn't done a lot of that sort of comedy at the time, but he really learnt as he went along, and I loved him. I thought he was great fun. I was married at that time, but I thought he was the most enormous fun, and not a bit like the first impression. I mean, during the run, we did discover that we had very similar backgrounds. I mean, we both came from working-class backgrounds. And then I think the turning point for me, for John, that really made me, I suppose, in a way, kind of fall in love with him, although I couldn't do anything about it, was we were driving. He had a little MG, and that was another thing. We shared a love of cars. I had a Morgan, and he had an MG. And we went for a ride in Scotland when we were on tour with the roof down, and he put some music on, and it was Shostakovich. And it blew my mind. And he, this trendy young guy with the shirt undone and the medallion, you know, and the kind of bell bottoms, was mad about classical music, as was I. And John had Abigail by Sally, his first wife. I had my daughter Melanie by my first husband, who died. And they started playing together, and I used to look after Abigail occasionally, and it was eventually them who said, look, we'd like to be sisters, why don't you get married? John says that I proposed to him because he was much too shy to make the first approach. He was much too terrified that people were going to say, on your bike, you know, because he had no estimate of his own attractiveness or his own talent or his own anything, really. He thought women left. And many's the argument that we had, and I used to say, I'm not going. Whatever you do, I'm not going. Anyway, I jumped on him, according to him, and we got married. And then we had Joanna. So the two older girls were absolutely delighted to have another sister of their own. And John adopted Melanie, officially adopted her, so that she wasn't just a stepdaughter. So it's worked out terribly well, really. I think they probably love one another more than if they'd all been exactly the same parentage, because I think they think they're lucky to be with one another, really. He has had a household full of women, of course. There's 3 daughters, and at one point we had a female cat, and I think he did think that was a step too far. And he used to sometimes say, oh, God, I'm surrounded by women. I'm surrounded by women. Help me. Get out of my hair and all that. But he liked it. They fussed him, and he really thought that was all rather nice.
He was terribly funny. I mean, that's the strongest memory, you know, that I have of him. He was a terribly funny man, wasn't he? He was a brilliant mimic. So he could do anybody instantly. Someone who just came delivering milk, someone or one of our various boyfriends. Yes, that was embarrassing, but... And he always had daft dances, silly dances.
But I have to say, he did the cooking a lot of the time. Did get quite grumpy sometimes if it didn't go well.
He was convinced he was absolute ace on the barbecue. This was a fatal mistake. And he had sausages that particular afternoon. He was trying to cook. And he couldn't light it. As he became more and more morose, more and more Mancunian, a lot of strange four-letter words arriving in monosyllabic. And he couldn't light it, so he hadn't got proper fuel. He thought he could just do it because he thought a brilliant cook. He had a gift, and we tried everything. We tried paraffin, we tried petrol, we tried gin, and it just didn't seem to ignite. But finally, it did sort of flicker into life. And after another hour and a half, when we knew what you know, barbecues, if they don't light, hell, we got these sausages. And they were done. They weren't raw or anything. He'd done them beautifully. But of course, you see, the flavour of paraffin doesn't really go with sausages. And so it was a bit of a bleak meal.
But it was always quite funny that he was grumpy, you know, and that I think must have driven him mad, because sometimes he'd be so grumpy we would just laugh at him.
I mean, it's strange that he had all these women. I guess they helped bring him round to the idea that women were all right because they loved him so much. I mean, the great thing about our marriage was that he started off very suspicious and very defensive and very angry and all sorts of things. And I think he learnt to love. I mean, certainly the last months of his life, he was the most loving man you could have. And I think that was one of his biggest triumphs, that he was a boy who wasn't taught to love as a boy, but learnt to love as an adult. And I think to do that is a mega triumph.
There were lots of laughs, lots of fun.
Get your trousers on. You're nicked.
And there was a very close relationship between the regular cast and the crew. Lots of parties, lots of people getting drunk. Having said that, you know, everyone turned up on time the next morning and did their stuff.
Here he is, Sir John Thaw.
Because I knew John, and because I knew he had this great sense of humour, as did Dennis, I tended to put a lot more humour into the Sweeney than other writers.
I'll give them this! I'll stun 'em, babe! Why, you can't miss! Just pin my star to a chart! The song's gonna come from the heart!
Together now!
I'll be gone!
Nobody knew who he was until the first episode of Sweeney, and then it was an overnight success, and he was a sex symbol. He's going, what? Oh, John, you're a sex symbol. It says so in the paper. Oh, shut up, don't be stupid.
You know, sort of man you would like.
My mum probably fancied him.
He was astonishingly sexy, didn't wear it on his sleeve, very, very self-contained, but he had the most astonishing appeal.
He had the most devastating blue eyes. And John would look into your eyes and, you know, turn your heart over. I'm sure he did that to every woman watching.
John started speaking and I started swooning. So we were sitting across the table at lunch and I was just leaning forward like this. And it cut, and then I'd sit back and it would stop. And then we did it again. We did another take, action. And I started swooning again, because John's eyes were the most amazing blue, and they would just open. And I was just diving into his face. And the director said, cut. And I said, God, John. I said, your eyes are amazing. I said, I'm just swooning into your face. And he went bright red and giggled.
Hello.
Yes?
Remember me?
Yes.
I'm your son.
I know.
Are you going to ask me in?
No.
I don't think John made a decision to do a role because he felt he could be successfully popular within it. I think he was, if you like, more selfish than that. I think it was, can I bring something to this part? You know, will it challenge me? Will I enjoy it?
And I think actors can be divided very, very generally into two sorts of people. And those that take say, what can I get out of this part, this role? And those that give say, what can I give this role? What can I do to help it? John was a supreme example of the second.
He had almost a third eye in his head while you were performing a scene. Most actors are just trying to get from one end to the other without drying on camera. With John, this third eye would tell him if it was getting boring or the scene was kind of subsiding, and he could engage a third gear, if you like, and it just took off like a rocket booster, this sort of oomph. And if you were working with him, you went, oh, right, oh, we're really in a scene here. And you hung onto his shirt tails and went along for the ride.
And I think the bottom line was, I didn't want to let him down.
I'm convinced he made other actors act well.
If he appreciated you and what you were doing, he was fantastically good about making sure you were being appreciated. I remember doing a scene with him in Kavanagh, and I had to cry in a scene, and we were sitting there, and, you know, as ever, there was lots to do. So we finished the scene, and the crew started to move off. And John went, hang on, he said. That's not easy, you know, doing that. You don't just do that and move on. That was something.
Part of John's great technique was to be absolutely prepared, not just with the words, because, as I say, he always had his script under his arm, but when we did Mr. Tom, for instance, there are a group of skills he had to learn, only sufficiently enough, of course, to convince us on camera, but he had to play the organ, he had to hone knives, he had to do some roofing and build a chair. He would make sure that he had the right people around him to teach him how to do those things sufficiently enough to seem convincing.
Oh, brilliant.
He worked here. He would sit for hours with his scripts, paring it down, paring it down, paring down. And I think that absolutely sums up his work.
I would occasionally do lines with him,
in the old days, reading the bits in between. I used to love doing that as well. I used to ask to do that, so maybe he was just doing that as a favour.
He actually became the character. And I think the combination of this face that the camera... I mean, there was a shot in the final Morse, which when I watched it, I found it very moving, but I also thought nobody but John could have quite held it. He's alone in his room thinking that he's resigning and, you know, everything, you know, the police job is over and where the hell is he, and he's alone and he hasn't got a woman and everything. And the camera pans in very, very slowly, very, very slowly. And John did nothing. He did nothing, but he just... God knows what was going on in his head. I mean, probably what was going on in his head was this was the end of Morse, and he was really sad about that. Any other actor would have been tempted to move the eye line or take a cigarette puff or take a drink or look out the window. No, just sat there. And that kind of simplicity, I think, works amazingly.
But I do remember him saying to me, always keep coming out of a different corner, always keep them guessing.
This is one of John's great strengths. His readings were so unexpected. They were so surprising, fresh, always. John came in as Doolittle, the dustman, to Higgins, and said, I've been in Edward Street, Governor. Higgins says, in a public house, yes? And Doolittle's line was, yes, Governor, why shouldn't I? And that why shouldn't I is usually done as a kind of Wilfrid Lawson wheedle. Why shouldn't I? Not young Thaw. Thaw had... I mean, he was an intelligent man and a well-read man, and he knew what he was doing. He knew his Bernard Shaw. And he realised that underneath this wonderful levity, particularly in a light-hearted piece like Pygmalion, always with Bernard Shaw, there is this undercurrent of this detestation of the poverty, of the violence and degradation that poverty inevitably breeds. And his reading of the line of being in a public house, yes, Governor, why shouldn't I? And it was wonderful. There was just that little flash of the stuff that turns people into Marxists.
He could not bear sentiment. And that's why it was so moving, because he didn't ever say, look how sad I'm being, or look how sad this is, and look at these real tears and things like that. Tears would be the last resort. And that wonderful scene where he's talking to that boy and he just says it.
You think you're the only person who ever lost anybody?
And he often used to say to me, if I was getting my knickers in a twist about a scene, he used to say, just say the words, kid. Just say the words. And if they're good enough, they'll carry you.
How do you think I felt, eh, when it happened to me? It's not just my wife I lost, you know. She was my best pal as well. My very best. And my lad. May not even here.
John really needed people around him that he could trust. He didn't trust lots of people, to be perfectly honest. He was very suspicious. So he had to have his scallywags, as he called them, round him, which was his dresser and his stand-in and his driver, and Pauline, who was continuity.
Yeah. That originated from the Sweeney days. Because we're always messing around, and he said, you pair of scallywags. That's it, yeah. But I bet it was his answer to the Rat Pack.
If they were on location, he would always go out with them, not anybody else, not the actors.
It's just wanted a normal night out with normal people. As far as we're concerned, I'm concerned, we're normal working people.
We were like his family when they weren't there.
An extension to his family.
Yeah.
They boosted him and they supported him and they understood him. I think they knew how to handle his moods.
Me and Barry would then start saying little things just behind his back or in his earshot. And he wouldn't take any notice. Then we'd go on a little bit further and say it again. And then you'd get a little snirk from his mouth. And then we'd say, we've cracked it now. Then we'd go on again and he'd say, F off, you two. Driving me mad, go away. And then he'd be out of it.
I never saw him grumpy, but he was unbelievably shy.
He was an introvert and thoughtful.
Probably a shy extrovert.
He had a difficult time as a child, and I think he protected himself as a result of it, and there was a wall of protectiveness that very few managed to break down, and it was something amazing that was inside, and you just had to batter at it to get to it.
Funnily enough, last night, one of my daughters burnt a tart and was in tears, as we often are at the moment, and she said, "Oh, if only Dad had been here." And I said, "Well, what would he have done?" And she said, "Well, he would have laughed at it. He'd have cracked some joke, and it would have been all right. He'd have made it okay." And he was wonderful. He had an extremely eccentric turn of humour. He would, I mean, honestly, it's quite unusual, isn't it, to be with somebody for 30 years and still be able to cry with laughter. I mean, he has had me crying with laughter.
Sorry, Mr. Proctor. One thing. You said you're really nervous because you've got to kiss me. And I said, I'm not. I'm not nervous. And of course, I was absolutely beside myself because this wasn't a peck on the cheek. This was supposed to be a long, lingering kiss. Happy birthday, gorgeous. And I said, it just seems the wrong thing to do. You're a national treasure, John, and you shouldn't be rummaged around with.
The 1998 Special Recognition Award goes to John Thaw.
John Thaw for Inspector Morse. John Thaw.
John almost hated the celebrity lifestyle, going to parties, going to first nights, going to awards, even going to awards, you know, where he was going to be awarded.
After the 5th year, we were out in Australia and he'd been given a CBE during the break between the 2 series, and he thought that was hysterical, and he used it right through the following series whenever he was put in an awkward position or had to say a line that he thought was a bit iffy. So, I can't say this, I'm a commander of the British Empire.
The first day I met John, I was very, very nervous, and I came to the makeup room and I said, before he could say anything, I said, "Hello, John, I'm Claire." And he said, "Hello, Claire, I'm John." And I thought, oh no, this is awful. That was the end of the conversation. But I was incredibly fortunate because my first line in the whole thing was, "Do you know where I might find a detective chief inspector? Looks like Mouse."
Morse. Detective Chief Inspector Morse.
And the first time I did it, the first rehearsal, there were about 20 policemen around, all the crew, Kevin and everybody else, and everybody laughed and laughed and laughed. And it was the most brilliant icebreaker.
First met John in 1985 when I first left drama school. It was my first job in rep. My parents came to see the show. It was my first professional job, you know, after 3 years at drama school. And all I was like the door opened this far, and I pushed a summons through and delivered it to them, and then the door closed. I inadvertently told him that my parents were coming to see the show that night beforehand. And all I had to say was, "This is your summons. Please appear at various magistrates at this time." But it was set through a door with that much gap, yeah? Anyway, my parents are in the audience, front row. Of course, I bang on the door goes wide open. He says, "Come in, officer." I tried. I couldn't say a word. And there he was, twinkling, looking upstage at me, going, "Welcome to the professional theatre, Mr. Kemp."
He never forgot the fact that his own career was finally brought to fruition in study terms at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art because he got a grant, because he got a scholarship, a bursary, which he couldn't have attended, rather, without that help. And whenever he got a major contract for whatever it was, principally on television, he would put a portion of that, not enormous, but a very significant proportion of that, into the bursary funds and the building funds at RADA.
He was so good in the roles he played in things like the Sweeney and Morse that the broadcasters wanted him to go on forever, and I know he often had to fight his way out. All sorts of inducements were made to him to stay playing a part, and he would say, look, I'm terribly sorry, I've just done enough, I can't give any more to this.
The final death of Inspector Morse in the main quad at Exeter College. He had to keel over on the lawn. Camera was set up, turned over, jammed. The crew went off to check the camera. Camera was perfectly well. Jammed again. Take 2. Take 3, it jammed again. Take 4, it jammed again. Take 5, it jammed again. No one could understand it. They got the final shot on take 6. Now this is really peculiar because we've never had any trouble with the camera for years and years and years. And there's one shot they had of Inspector Morse dying in front of their camera, and he didn't want to shoot it.
I know he enjoyed the opportunity to play, if you like, more limited roles, certainly in the theatre and cinema, but also in television, in films and two-part series.
What I now have to say, let every man take very good notice of, for I will answer to it in England. Yea, and before Her Majesty.
I've been proud of him every day of his life. I was proud the day he was born. I was proud the first day he toddled and the first day he talked. I was proud of him every day of his life. What's this special pride just because he's dead?
Look, I don't need to tell you, this country has a special kind of problem. Man, do you think I like banning and detaining people without trial? I'm a lawyer. It goes against the grain.
I knew a properly equipped and trained bomber force would save this island from blockade and was the only means of taking the war to the enemy should it happen. And now it's happened.
You can have talent, but if you have talent without character, then it amounts to nothing. John had that moral authority, which is why he was brilliant at playing policemen and lawyers, authority politicians.
I will not let one of you down. I will not.
He was playing Cardinal Wolsey, who was a working man in the Court of Kings. And there was something about John, which was a working man in the Court of Kings in his professional life. When the fall from grace happened in that particular play, he was able to tap on something which was about class difference, about the pain of being displaced. And there was something in him which came back from his origins and his background that I could recognize that he was tapping into.
Even when John was giving wonderful performances and tremendous accolades about what he was doing, John would come back and say, hope I got it right tonight. Hope I did. I think I might have done. And but he didn't. Don't think he knew how good he was.
He was a very, very potent stage actor. However, having said that, John wasn't ashamed to be a television actor. He always realised the potency of television. He's been a lucky guy that people who right at the beginning, like Troy Kennedy Martin and all those sort of people, saw this special thing that he had.
And he had a beautiful house in the country and surrounded by big high brick walls. And one day he said to me, "Ray, come and have a walk in the garden with me. Remember Burnage?" I said, "Yes, I do." He said, "Do you know, I had a dream that I didn't tell anybody about. And the dream was that one day I was going to have a beautiful home with a beautiful garden and brick walls all round so nobody could see me, and I was safe and protected." And he said to me, "That's what I've achieved."
He loved it. I mean, This house, John often used to sit here and say, "We cracked it, kid. We cracked it." I mean, it was very important to John, coming from the background he did, and I suppose to me, to have lovely things. Oh, and the lovely grandchildren, joy of my life. He was a bit frightened of the grandchildren, bit frightened that they might tell him where to get off. I mean, it is the best time to having grandchildren, it really is. And John enjoyed it.
It gives me special pleasure then to award the BAFTA Fellowship to John Thaw.
I was very pleased that I gave him his BAFTA Fellowship Award, and we had a reunion. And the last conversation I had with him, his voice was weakened by the cancer, so I didn't like to pester him too much. And then he took me back again to our early years of joking. We both had known this very camp musician who used to speak in a very strange and affected way. And one of the things he used to say was, "Let's commit telephonage." and John reminded me of this. It was the last thing he ever said to me. He said, "I tell you what, Tommy, we'll commit telephonage." And we never did anymore. But it was a sweet little note to go out on.
I feel like I've lost a brother more than anything else, because he was very loyal, genuine, looked after you.
On one of those swings, none of us had a chance to say goodbye.
No.
But he was just wonderful. I mean, he had a rough time. Not agonizing, but rough. And he just ignored it. I mean, John had this ability, and I think this probably stems right back from his mother leaving him. If something didn't please him, he could not look at it. He could turn his back on it. And that's what he did with his mother. He did not choose to ever forgive her or find out about her. He did see her once, but he didn't like her. And he could just go and walk out of it, you know? And it stood him in very good stead with his illness, because, you know, I'd say to him sometimes, "God, you're going through it, aren't you?" And he said, "I've got no choice." And that was his attitude. And it made it very easy for everybody around him, because he wasn't moaning. He never moaned. I mean, the night before, we walked around this garden, and he was hanging on a bit, but he was still well strong. And we had a Lancashire hot pot, which he suddenly wanted. And then that night, in the middle of the night, one knew that things were going down here. I mean, I had been warned that it would only be a matter of days and weeks if we were lucky. And John had, but again, chose not to hear it. We only had one slight weep together at one stage, but even then he didn't talk about it. We just hung on to one another. But towards the end, people kept saying alarming things that might happen, but I took the risk because I knew he'd want to be here. And he died here. And that's what he would have wanted. And the children were here, and the grandchildren were here. And this was what he worked for. This was what he loved. This was when he was himself. He wasn't Morse, he wasn't Sweeney, he wasn't any of the things that the public thought he was. He was a husband and a father and a man. And that's what he was when he died, you know? Much missed, I'm afraid. Much missed.
Frenzied attack, she said. So where was he killed? Where's the blood?
Valerie Craven is dead.
be dead. And if she is dead, how can she write this letter and post it?
25 years of Inspector Morse continues next with more from Oxford's finest.
Airwick Refills sponsor ITV3 Afternoons.